Open Market is sponsored by AdLib, the self-serve DSP solution making advertising easy. What do the world's largest demand-side platforms have in common? They're effective, but they require large annual contracts and spend minimums. With AdLib, growing agencies get a single platform that connects to every top global DSP with no contracts, no spend minimums, and G2's #1 ranked support. That means access to the entire universe of TV, digital out-of-home, audio, display, video, and native without a hassle and with no blind spots. It's incredibly easy to use, plus it can automate most of the work your team spends hours a day doing manually. Get the most powerful media buying technology without the barriers to entry. Check out AdLib at getadlib.com today.
Welcome to Open Market, a show about founding, building, and growing companies in the advertising industry. This is Joe Zappa, and I'm joined by Eric Franchi.
You changed the pronunciation.
Yeah, so I think, are we vilifying Ari Paparo? Is he responsible for this mispronunciation of the Franchi legacy?
Ari Paparo. We just never talked about it. So for listeners that are not like on X 24/7, we had an episode of the Marketecture Pod. We had 3 people on, and all 3 people pronounced Ari's name differently. And I used Joe pointing this out as an opportunity to say that after, 70 something episodes of Marketecture, Ari pronounces my name differently than I do. And we've never stopped each other. We've never talked about it. Now it's out in the open.
Yeah, so we have Ari, and Ari, and then Franchi versus Franchi. Franchi is, to me, very Long Island, Staten Island. So I'm from Long Island, you're from Staten Island. And yeah, we love that A sound in Long Island. I don't know, I was ridiculed by a lot of people in Long Island for my non-Long Island accent, but now I'm sure someone will jump out of the woodwork and be like, you actually sound so Long Island. But as a child, I resented that. And I was like, actually, I'm special and I do not have that accent.
Same thing here. I had a strong accent growing up. It is completely unavoidable on Staten Island, particularly growing up in the sort of era that I did. I went to college in Pennsylvania and I got absolutely ripped for that accent. It was unsustainable. It was either like lose the accent or go back, tail between my legs to a New York City school. I tried to lose the accent and that didn't work. But I found just over time, being amongst people that spoke differently, I just began speaking differently. And by the time I came back 4 years later, like I had less of an accent or maybe no accent. I don't know.
Yeah, there are very few words that I think I really pronounce with a Long Island accent. But for example, one I had to learn was like, a drawer, like you take a knife out of a drawer. Like we said, drawer, open the drawer. So yeah, my mom still has that accent and I make fun of her and she doesn't always appreciate that. I'm your mother.
Amazing. All right, let's get into it. Let's talk ad tech. Let's talk ad tech marketing. So for the past few episodes, I feel like I've been on the receiving end of the questions. For this episode, we're going to talk about how to win in ad tech marketing. And for this, I've got an expert that I can start to talk to and interview, and that's you, Joe. So you've got a very helpful framework of the 4 different ways, effectively, to win in ad tech, in marketing. And I thought it was interesting. And I tried to figure out the best way to do this. And I drew like a 2x2 and I drew like the thing where it's like up and to the right. Neither of them worked, but you have a little bit of a framework where it's like, if you are a company, here's 2 paths. If you are a person, here's 2 paths. And they don't need to be mutually exclusive, but it's like good ideas depending on who you are, where you work, what you do. So I'd love to just like hop right into it. And do you think about that with that framework way, or I just like look at the world differently?
Yeah, so I'm always workshopping it. I'm not a very spatial thinker, so I don't think about it in terms of quadrants or whatever. This actually makes me think of Ari's models, like he's releasing a model per week recently. Yeah, he just did the slot model. That's not how my brain works at all. I'm like so words and verbal that I don't necessarily think of it that way. But I would say so with these 4 ways. So the first one is to have a differentiated story or own narrative white space. And we'll dive deeper into it. But I think that's sort of the foundation. Like that's table stakes. Ideally, everyone wants to have some level of differentiation in their narrative, which could be as extreme as like owning a category, or it could be like you're one of 70 SSPs and you have like a slight tweak or you have a specific thing within that world that you own. So that's the foundation. Then the other 3 are, have unique data or insights that you're sharing with the market. be prolific, present, and personable. And then thought leadership are the other three.
It's a pyramid,
The,
actually.
yeah, exactly. I think that first thing is kind of at the base of the pyramid. Like, ideally, no matter what you're doing, you want to have some sort of differentiated story at the foundation of it. And then all of the other things are like more effective if you have that differentiated story. And they also make the story, the foundation reinforces what you lay on top of it.
Got it. Okay. So for differentiated story, give us some examples of you think maybe a company or companies that are doing this well. And when you look at them, what do you see in terms of, like what well is or what success is or what excellence is?
Yeah, so an extreme example is owning a category. And so Scope 3 would be a good recent example of this, right? Where they've basically become in short order synonymous with sustainability and ad tech. To really own a category, you need a couple things though. You need to actually be playing in a category that is either new or that not that many people are playing in. So it's partially like a product and company vision thing. And
Timing
the
thing too.
other, yeah, as a VC in particular, you'd appreciate that aspect of it. And then you also need to be a great storyteller and you need to be present in market. So that's where I'm saying, those are things 3 and 4, or ways 3 and 4 to win, right? But they reinforce the having the differentiated story bit because, if you have a differentiated story, but you're not sharing it with people all the time and you're not visible, you're not going to own the category. Even, you can be creating a new category and you're absent and just no one knows that category exists. So you want to create that differentiated story, but then you also have to propagate it. Another way that I think about this is like today I was in a meeting and we were talking about the company's offerings and they're giving me their story. And I was like, okay, as it often happens in ad tech, we're getting into the complexities of this. When you say it to me, it makes sense. But I think the problem is like 20 other companies are talking about this stuff. Like, let's say identity, right? Like, everyone's talking about identity. So you can have a smart take on it, but it's still very hard to differentiate. And so, what I think it comes down to is saying, like, what do we do that no one else does? And let's assume that we only get to be known for one thing, that we get one adjective. What do we want that adjective to be?
And this way to win, right? This idea of like, differentiated story or like sort of owning a white space. How much are the winning companies talking about the category versus talking about themselves?
I think they are going to talk about the category a lot. And then they should also have something to say about how they have a unique approach to it. But when it's most effective, this is a matter of almost making yourself synonymous with the category, right? So again, I think Scope 3 has been very effective at that. Let's take a bit of a harder example. Okay, so let's say you're a DSP or an SSP. You have like, dozens or maybe even hundreds of competitors. So you're not creating that category, right? The category has already been created. I think in that case, what you need to do is try to exploit a unique connection between your product and your customers. So, like Beeswax is a canonical example of this with their control freak messaging, right? Where they said, we have this very customizable, granular DSP. We are attracting the types of media buyers who have like large data teams and really want to get into the nitty gritty. And so our differentiated story is that we are the DSP for control freaks. I think another way you can go about it is to ask your customers, right? Like if you're wondering, okay, well, how am I going to unearth this? The key is, I think generally you don't want to try to figure this out by just getting your smartest people in a room and like hash it out, divorced from the customer. You want to synthesize what the executive team thinks and where they want to go and what they love about the company with what the customers think, so that you can be sure that as you go off and tell this visionary story, it's a vision that the customers will support and in turn amplify.
We talked about this. Maybe it was the last episode when we talked about like, if your market is too small or if you need another market to grow into, like how to execute it effectively from like a roadmap perspective. This is literally the same thing.
It's the same thing because when we were talking about how to reposition a company, it's like there are similarities between creating a story from scratch and shifting a story, right? In either case, you want to take intelligence from your customers and then you can lead them a bit, but you still make sure that they are informing the narrative and that they'll get on board with it and amplify it. Because also, once you do come up with the story, so let's say you hire someone like me and I help you hone the story and I rewrite your site. Great. Now we have a new face. We know how we want to present to the market. If your customers won't attest to the validity of the story, if they won't do case studies, if they won't talk to the press, get featured in the rest of your content, then the story is going to go a lot less far.
Yeah, it's so funny. Paul Negton, our mutual friend, he posted something the other day, and I've used it in so many conversations. I'm actually going to pop it into the screen here. Is this not this is like the meme of this podcast? This is the meme of like 2024, frankly, for AdTech. For those listening, it's a picture of Don Draper, presenting in the room during the sort of classic Mad Men era, and and he's trying to whiteboard this that's kind of blurred out, and it says, "Talk to some effing customers," which is amazing.
Yeah, a lot of what I learned about the strategic marketing process, I learned from Paul, and I collaborate with him. So he's really smart on this topic, and he was the CMO of Beeswax also. So obviously had a role in devising that messaging. And yeah, it should be no surprise that this is in large part an ad tech growth, ad tech sales and marketing podcast. And so often what we're going to talk about when we're saying, how do you figure out a strategy, is indeed talk to some effing customers.
Yes. Okay. So is there anything more to talk about of this foundational layer of the pyramid of, differentiating in the market or carving out white space, or should we go up to the next level?
The only last thing I'll say is that when I think about a message, I think it needs to achieve three things. It needs to be very clear what you do and for whom. It needs to be a galvanizing message, or Paul says a crusade. So it has to be something that's going to get your customers excited, that's going to make sense to them on a visceral or immediate level. And it needs to be differentiated. And if your message does those three things, you're probably doing better than 90% of ad tech companies. And most of the messages don't, because they're trying to cover too many things, right? So it's like, we use data and like audiences to increase performance for advertisers. It's like, well, you do, but also everyone does that. So that's where like the messages tend to get watered down.
That's the copy of like 75% of ad tech right there of websites.
Yeah, exactly. It's always like enhancing digital advertising or helping advertisers reach their potential or something like that. And it has to be narrower, bolder, more specific.
Number 2, ways to win. Share insights based on proprietary data or singular analytical capabilities. There's a lot there. What do you mean?
So there are 3 levels of messages. There's the big story, which we just talked about. There is what I call house topics and POV. So it's like, what are the 5 issues we want to own in the market and what is our perspective on them? And then the third most granular level of messaging that you're going to share with the market is actually content based on unique data or analysis. So that's what we're talking about here. The best recent example of this is Analytics, right? They essentially have one of the best PR and content marketing operations going in the business. And the foundation of that approach is analyzing the data at their disposal and then sharing interesting patterns that other people aren't seeing to like reveal industry issues. Now, there's a bent to theirs, like they go after particularly controversial or problematic topics. So that's what like really helps them get like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal to cover what they do. But even if you don't want to be as bold and you don't want to court controversy, you may still be able to look at the data that's in your platform or look at data across your customers, anonymize it, recognize patterns, and then share those with the market. And for my newsletter, I think back in the fall, I actually spoke to Christoph from Analytics about his approach here. And so I have some tips for the audience on if you're like, okay, well, yeah, what Analytics does is, super elaborate. They have these like 200-page research reports. Christoph himself is a PhD, but like, how am I going to come up with similar original research? What he said is the first thing is you have someone in your business who's looking at patterns, right, in the data for your customers. And you want to take note whenever you see an unusual pattern, because unusual pattern indicates this might be news, this might be interesting to people. Even then, 90% of what they discover, Christoph said, they're not going to use. But about 10% of the time, a curiosity, something unusual that strikes their curiosity, will actually be a meaningful pattern. Second step, develop a brain trust of people. So if you're on the demand side, probably brand and agency people. If you're on the sell side, publishers who can take a look at the research you put together and poke holes in it, right? So they can tell you, oh, you think this is interesting, but it's actually not for X, Y, and Z reasons, or you're thinking about it this way and you should be thinking about it that way. And then the third thing is that once you have that interesting data and you verified with a group of people, probably external to the company, that it's robust and worth sharing with the market, you want to develop it into a story that takes both data people who really understand and can analyze the market and marketing people who know how to tell stories, who can simplify it, and who can make sure that it's going to be interesting for like journalists and also the layperson who doesn't have the level of data expertise that your engineering or product people poring over the data might have.
Yeah, that's a lot. That was like a bit of a sort of masterclass in 2 minutes. There's some businesses that inherently are suited to do this. Analytics being an extreme example. Companies that I'm involved with the fund that, again, because of the nature of them, they can just do this, right? Sincera being one, T-Vision Insights being another. They've just got attention data on TV, so they could very easily kind of talk about what people are watching, what they're paying attention to, what they're not. I would think that if you are some sort of platform business, right? So this probably extends to maybe not just like, analytics businesses, but DSPs, SSPs, folks that, are sitting on a lot of data. There's got to be some insights that you can use to start to bring interesting insights to the market, interesting insights to your customers. And it doesn't need to be like groundbreaking, industry shifting like analytics, but it could probably be like a cool sales tool to help educate your customers and, build a little bit of brand along the way.
Yeah, I have a client that is a publisher business intelligence platform, right? So that like they see what's going on across a bunch of different SSPs and the money that various advertisers are spending and whatever. And obviously it would all be anonymized. But if you could just share trends, I mean, even that is highly valuable to publishers or the press, right? Another thing that I would consider doing in this case, and Analytics does this masterfully, is, hey, we have access to all of this data. Here are some of the trends that we're seeing. Like, do you find this interesting? Or does this raise any other questions for you that you would want us to go investigate? Because that will be vastly more interesting than the average ad tech pitch, which is like, let me tell you about my product. It's like, let me directly serve your audience, journalist, by providing concrete evidence about the trends you think you may or may not be seeing in the market.
Makes sense. Okay. So foundational layer is, like strong differentiation, carving out white space. Number two is, proprietary data or analytics that, drive insights and then also kind of feed and reinforce that differentiation. Anything more there, or do we go up the stack?
The only other thing I'll say is I think a lot of people might be listening to this. They're like, Joe, that sounds great, but like, how are we ever going to make that happen? Right. And I do think like this is a line item. Like this is something that ideally you have to put a little money behind, or at least put a significant amount of time behind. Like the companies that do this, like Analytics, I think reap tremendous rewards from it because they're able to own industry news cycles or drive them. But to do that, you need company leadership who thinks it's important, or at the very least, marketing leadership that thinks it's important. And then you need collaboration between the marketing team and like data analysts or engineers to actually analyze and surface the data. So if you're listening to this and you think that's interesting, I want to be like a mini analytics, like I want to drive some of these news cycles and share original insights with the industry, it takes alignment, I think, from the leadership of the company on down.
I think that makes perfect sense. One of the best things that we did at Undertone when we reached a certain scale was hiring a head of insights. So this person was responsible for looking at everything and then coming up with those unique insights that we observed. And again, an undertone, especially back then, this was all about like, what are people doing around creative? And then using that to educate the market, fuel the thought leadership that others in the company would talk about, or just like be a ride along and be the secret seller that is not selling at all, but just educating. You need to be at a certain scale to do something like that, but done well. This thing, you can assign direct ROI to this type of stuff.
It's a huge growth driver. And also, I would add, it's not just a marketing tactic. That head of insights is also a resource for your clients. Who's going to get the deepest look at your data or the first look? Your clients. So you should view it not just as a marketing tool, but also something that's going to improve fulfillment.
Shout out to Laura Salant. I believe she's still there. All right, let's move up the stack. Number 3, lead the industry with thoughts on the news. So this is an interesting one. Is this a company thing? Is this a person thing? Or is this both?
Essentially, what we're talking about here in terms of a way to win with marketing is thought leadership. Thought leadership, oh boy, done very poorly by many people because the way it ends up playing out in practice, and this is why I think thought leadership is even like a negative term for many people or evokes negative emotions, is it's like, let's just look at what people are saying in Ad Exchange or in Adweek and then regurgitate it, right? So like how many PR departments or agencies like are still writing like boilerplate, like how to prepare for the end of cookies takes? Like it's not differentiated. It's been written 100 times, especially if the advice is the advice we've all heard before, which is like, collect more first party data. It's like, yes, we all know that. So if you really want to be a thought leader, it takes a couple things. One is, well, you got to have a thought leader. You got to have an evangelist, like someone like Ari is an extreme example. He's probably the most successful, or like Eric Seufert, right? Like they're the most prominent like ad tech thought leaders where it's like they've put a lot of time analyzing the industry and they release their thoughts regularly and all of that.
You got to put them aside, right? Those two, they're extreme examples and they are businesses unto themselves. I think where you're going is this idea of like the chief audience officer or, a person that could be, they have a day job, right? The co-founder, they're the founder, but they are the source of this information in the market.
Yeah. All it takes to get started with this is know what topics are interesting in the industry and pertinent to your business. So let's have 5 house topics that we want to be experts on and we want to share wisdom on with the market, and then develop a differentiated point of view, right? So that's it. 5 house topics and points of view. Those are generally generated through a combination of a subject matter expert who could be a co-founder, could be a product person, and a marketer, right? Who understands like what's the discourse in the industry and how can we make a dent. So you want to develop those topics and POVs, and then you want to make sure that you're getting out there with them consistently. And both of those two things, though they may sound simple when you say them on a podcast, are actually very hard. And it's a bar that not a lot of companies meet because it's hard to have a differentiated point of view. You need like people with subject matter expertise, and you also need people who are good at challenging them to like get specific. And like if you say, okay, we want to be an expert on identity. Okay, that's really hard. A lot of people talking about identity. If I ask the average ad tech executive about that, they'll probably give me like a spiel that is very similar. And it's my job as the marketer to say, actually, I don't think that's that differentiated. And ask follow-up questions like, what are you seeing specifically with our customers on this? What do most people in the market get wrong about this? Like it's questions like that that can lead the thought leader to a differentiated POV. And then the next thing is the consistency bit. Like, there are a lot of companies that want to win with thought leadership, but I don't think they're actually prepared to do what it takes to become a thought leader. Like Ari has his 25,000 Twitter followers or whatever it is. You don't get those by like hiring a PR agency and like doing one ad exchange or byline a quarter. You get it by pounding the table every week, if not every day, sharing those points of view that you've developed.
That's a great point. I run across so many people, in my line of work, both, like founders, but also people at big companies that are just so smart, have such a, interesting and unique POV. And oftentimes I'm like, this information needs to get out there. Like, you need to be talking about this. But I think one, amazing, unique thought does not the thought leader make. So the commitment to doing it, the process to, refine it, and then the consistency is what separates, I think, the winners from, all the people that, could be, kind of smart thought leaders. All right. So thought leadership is the, third rung of the pyramid. And at the very top, you're going into the really kind of like qualitative and soft stuff. So be prolific, be present, be personable. So the three Ps.
Yeah. I think there's an element of it that isn't intangible. Like, be present, be prolific, win on volume. It's an undervalued strategy in ad tech marketing. Show me any category in this industry, and I can probably tell you there are only a few people who are super prevalent, right? Like, obviously, like DSPs and SSPs are like the biggest technology categories or whatever. But even so, I don't know. How many thought leaders are there who are at DSPs who are really like leading the conversation on like how the DSP is evolving to meet those needs and all of that stuff? It's not many. So I think the good thing about ad tech is it's not like AI, for example. There is room in the discourse. If you were an ad tech co-founder or, an ad tech executive, and you figured out 5 topics in the industry and the interesting novel things you have to say about each of those topics, and you were to tweet 3 times a day about them, which may sound like a ton in the beginning, but you get used to it, you will make a dent. You will get known. People like Eric will notice you, and influencing the influencers, which includes like the journalists, many of whom are on AdTech Twitter, for example, or LinkedIn, makes a difference. How does it make a difference? Well, the point of everything we're talking about with these 4 ways to win with AdTech marketing is to build your reputation and relationships at scale. Very simply, that is the point of AdTech marketing. We want people to know who we are. We want them to know how we're different. We want them to know how we can solve their problems. And we want them, once they've heard of us, to occasionally reach out. And then we have a coffee to deepen the relationship and thus kickstart the sales process.
So examples of this, I'm going to challenge you a little bit. So we've named, people that are out there and doing this well in previous pods. Give us an example of a person that is doing this well that you think is an up-and-comer, or you've paid attention to, or people should pay attention to, that's not someone who we've pointed to previously. Can you?
Yeah. So we talked about Michael Bishop before. I think he's starting to do this. Søren Larsen is another very smart co-founder of a company called Crosshatch. They're both about my age. And I think they are 2 good examples of like next gen ad tech founders who within like 10 to 15 years will have a substantial platform in the space. Also, low key, if you will all forgive me, like, this is how I made my reputation in the space, whatever that's worth. We've talked about this before. That's why we're on this podcast together. Yeah. I was tweeting up a storm. You found me via Twitter. You asked me to hang out, and here we are, right? So it can make a difference pretty quickly. You need to give it a little time. Don't expect it to work overnight. And I think 90% of people who hear this and feel inspired, like, frankly, will quit. And if you're listening and you're like, I will persevere, then that's your opportunity. I rarely see this fail. Like, the be present and prolific strategy, there are only really 2 ways to like fail miserably at it. Like, one is if you're a dick. If you're really present and you're being present by annoying people, that might not work out so well for you. And the other is if you're just posting like stuff that feels like ChatGPT wrote it, which is a thing. It's more of a problem on LinkedIn than Twitter. But there are a lot of people who use some sort of AI assistant to write stuff for them and to do comments and whatever. And it's like, dude, the whole point of this is to build relationships. No one's fooled by this.
You just made me think of something I haven't thought about in years. That was great, by the way. Do you remember there was a trend a few years ago, and there was a name for it? I want to say that Alex Kantrowitz might have actually coined this term, but I could be completely wrong here. Broetry?
Oh, yeah. I'm a broet. I write beautiful broetry on LinkedIn. It's not as bad as the extreme examples of that, but like broetry is like, okay, I see what you're saying. There's like all things in literature, little seminar for you guys. there's a form and content element to this. So the form of Broetry is like, it looks like stanzas with like verses, right? Where it's like, though LinkedIn seems to favor like a lot of white space and very digestible content. So I do
and click
that
to
form.
expand.
Yeah, yeah. So you want to have a hook, little very tactical for you. You want to have a hook in the first like line or two of your LinkedIn post so that people in the feed will click to expand, and then that signals that more people should read it and they'll propagate it. So I absolutely do that. I would like to think that I do not do the content of Broetry, which would probably be something like what people call hustle porn. Though like I will do hustle porn occasionally, and that's just the price of being a content creator.
I'm laughing hysterically because I'm just picturing just all the Broetry of the past and how ridiculous it was. This was awesome. I revised my diagram.
Oh, nice. I love
There
it.
you
So
go.
Eric is holding up a pyramid where differentiator and white space is at the foundation. Then the next layer is proprietary data and analytics. The layer above that is thought leadership. And the final layer at the top, prolific, present, and personable. So that's our little spatial model of how to win with ad tech marketing.
Yeah, you'll notice, and we should like actually design this and post this. But on one side, it's the sort of kind of content that builds reputation, and then the other
Mhm.
side, it's the actions, right? The thought leadership and the three Ps done with frequency and consistency that create reputation, right? Which are the two things that you talked about. So I think I tied it in a bow pretty good.
Yeah, I like it. It's like form and content. Yeah, what you're actually saying, and then how and how often you say it.
Yep, we've got our own slop.
Absolutely. We're coming for you, Ari.
All right, this has been awesome. Thank you, Joe. Anything more to add?
No, I think we're good to go. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll be in your ears again next week.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Bye.